That's the thing. If you study economics, accounting, banking, finance, you do not hear the story of how it really works. They actually want to keep you ignorant in a way and make you a worker for the system. And they reward you very well. And that's the deal that most people do. Well, I didn't want to do it. So I left again. I had no job. I spent 3 years in the British Library basically reading books.
Hello, everyone. We've got a special guest today, Tarek El Diwani, and I'm joined by my co-host, Harris Irfan. How's everyone doing today?
Good, thank you.
Thank you very well.
Good, Tarek. It's really a pleasure to meet you. Right before the call, I was telling you all the good things I've heard about you. I know you and Harris go way back. Maybe you can give us a little bit about your background and your expertise and how you got into your journey in Islamic finance.
Well, I think my father was a doctor and he wanted me to become a doctor, but I wasn't any good at the subjects. So I was sent off to a recruitment consultant in London. Um, this was in the late 1970s, early 80s. And they analysed me and told me that I should be an accountant. I regarded that as an insult at the time because, you know, I thought I was a creative person and that I could, invent things, but accountancy seemed to be like the opposite. The last thing you want in an accountant is creativity, right? So anyway, I was sent off to study economics and geography and things like that, which you didn't need to be too brainy to do, like medicine. You needed to be very brainy. So anyway, I went off and studied accounting and finance at university after that, and I went to work for KPMG in London. And after 6 months, I was so bored. I was traveling home one night and I bumped into some Eurobond dealers on the train. And we got chatting and they invited me back to their apartment and they had Ferraris. And this was strange because they were my age. They were 21 and 22. And I thought, well, people at this age, how did you get a Ferrari? I mean, you must be thieves, you know. And then I found out that they weren't thieves. And then much later, I found out that they were thieves, actually. But anyway, at the time, so,
We
you
can
know,
edit that out.
no, I don't mind. I mean, that is the truth, and we have to face up to the truth. But anyway, so I decided that I wanted to be a Eurobond dealer because you got paid 10 times as much as an accountant, and it was much more fun. You went to expensive restaurants and you travelled around the world to nice places and stayed in the best hotels. And at 21, who doesn't want that? So I left accountancy, and I then discovered that you can't just walk into a job as a Eurobond dealer or derivatives guy or whatever, because there's 10,000 other guys aged 21 who want it, and they're willing to, pervert the course of justice and, and history, whatever, to get that job. But anyway, I had I don't know, stroke of luck and I managed to get a position in the derivatives market. And at that stage, now we were about 1987. And I was sat in an office with, well, one half of it was money brokers. And these were people from, the London vegetable market. They used to sell oranges and apples, and they used to shout at each other across stands in Spitalfields or Smithfield's meat market, whatever, and it was a commodity that they would say apples, oranges, money. What's the difference? And so they imported these guys, and they were in half of the office, and they were shouting and screaming, and it was all a bit too loud for me, and they were swearing, and they were drinking 10 pints a day. But I noticed in the corner of the room there were 4 or 5 guys who were very quiet, and one of them was American, and they were very, very quiet, and they had computer screens, and they were doing huge deals, and the numbers had an extra 1 or 2 zeros on the end. And so these guys were shouting and screaming at one end of the room, and I noticed, it was all a bit too loud for me. And the other end of the room, there were some people who were talking very quietly and dealing much larger sums, even, hundreds of millions, billions possibly, and looking at computer screens and doing calculations. And I thought, well, this sounds a little bit more sort of intellectual. I'll go and see what they're doing. And anyway, they introduced me to the interest rate derivatives market. And I had a go, and I saw a sort of program that no one was using for options on government bonds. And I said, well, no one's using this, shall I? And they said, yes. And so there we are. My career as a bond derivatives dealer was born.
So something happened after that because you discovered Islamic finance in the late 80s. How did that happen and where did it go?
So, I mean, I did the job of dealing in bond derivatives and interest rate swap options and that kind of thing for 5 years. And um, that journey of seeing the way the financial markets worked was very beneficial. It was also very rewarding, I have to say. And having seen what was going on and had lots of lunches and dinners with quite senior bankers, I mean, much more senior than should have really been sitting with me at the age of 25, 26, 27 by this time. And hearing their stories of what was going on, I started to think, well, actually, this is actually very dangerous. And what's the basis of all of this, and what are the risks, and what's it actually doing for the world? So those questions started coming into my mind. And then by the early 90s, I had decided that I wanted to get out and do something that was actually beneficial in the world of finance. And I wasn't sure what it was. But I then, by chance, came across the topic of Islamic finance. And people who were talking about it in the local mosque, and I went to see them and hear what they had to say, and then I started reading, and then after about 6 months or so, I realized how the game actually works, because that's the thing. If you study economics, accounting, banking, finance, you do not hear the story of how it really works. They actually want to keep you ignorant in a way. They want to minimize the huge frauds, the conceptual irrationality of the system, and make you a worker for the system. And they reward you very well, and that's the deal that most people do. Well, I didn't want to do it. I decided that I wanted to change my direction. So I left again. Just one day I told them, look, I want to leave, and I left. Again, I had no job, but I'd earned enough money to last a little while, like 2 or 3 years. I did research. I joined the British Library. I spent 3 years in the British Library basically reading books, not just on conventional economics from, let's say, the detractors of economics from a secular point of view, but also from Muslim jurists, some of them who had written a long time ago. And I immediately recognized from the laws of Islamic jurisprudence why those laws were there. And I felt as if, having by this stage spent 3 years traveling around Islamic banking and finance conferences, and so on, hearing what people were saying, I was realizing that these guys don't actually know why these rules are here. And very senior people, chairmen of Islamic banks, scholars of Islam, they knew the fiqh, but they didn't know why it was so important. And I did, because I'd done the job. I'd been right in the middle of it. I knew how central banks inject money in the system and how banks, do. So I wanted to tell them. And I thought, well, I'll just write a book and explain, and that'll be it. Because once they see what I've seen, then of course they'll accept, the truth, and we. Which is completely naive, of course, because the politics and the vested interests in Islamic banking are even worse than they are in right. I mean, it's what Chomsky is. I often tell people that Chomsky has this great phrase. He calls it the threat of a good example. If someone comes along with a system that works, right, that means you don't have to be in debt and you don't have to both work. Your wife can look after the kids, and and you can go and work, but there's only one of you working, or your wife can where you stay home, right? And you're not in debt, and you've got a bigger house and a faster car and the nicer holidays, and you do this and you're not in debt. Then, I mean, that's a threat to them, right? So they don't want you to. So why should somebody who can demonstrate that, even theoretically, let alone practically, be given oxygen to breathe? And then I started to find that it wasn't just me; it was people, much more senior than me, people who had been in the position of president or prime minister or minister of finance, who'd been shut down over centuries. In fact, if you look back through the history to see what happened to American presidents, the assassins were sent to put a bullet in their head because they were trying to stop the practice of unsound money and debt ravaging the United States, for example. People like Jackson, Lincoln. So I felt that. This actually now was beyond my because one thing I'm hopeless at is politics. I just can't do it. I don't have the patience. I don't have the diplomatic skills. I just hate the whole thing. I find it mendacious. I find it conniving. And they are always reacting 10 years too late. So if you're driving a you need to react now. to some of these problems. They need to be done now, not after 5 years of committee hearings. And that's the kind of person I am. And I tried to find places where I could do that. But of course, you have to be a leader to do that. And you have to have people who are willing to work with you. And I feel, that's sort of, that brings us up to date in a way because, I've discovered that this isn't a technical problem, really. It's a political problem of getting reform of our financial system. Except that there is the issue of Bitcoin, which the proponents say sidesteps the political problem. It immediately emancipates the people and allows them to deal directly with each other without the interventional authorities or central banks or commercial banks. And that, to a very large degree, is true, not entirely true, but to a very large degree true.
Yeah.
So,
And
I mean, we went very. I'm glad you mentioned Bitcoin, and we didn't have to mention it to you, but we will come to that. And you very much are a gold bug. And in fact, you set out in this book, which, by the way, we are all waiting for an update on. Just to remind you, this book is not
I'm trying.
available.
I can tell. I have a day job though. That's the thing.
You know how much it's trading for on eBay? You
I
should
know.
look it up.
I've seen some guy selling it for £1,000, and honestly, he's made more money out of it than I ever did.
Yeah, so we're asking you to do an update on that, please, Tarek. But let's just talk about your views as a gold bug, because you've just touched on money that is not political, and you've mentioned Bitcoin in the process. But what I'd like to do is maybe just walk us through what you say about the gold standard and what a world that is on the gold standard would look like.
and
Yes.
and Tarek, just before we get into that, because I didn't want to interrupt you, you were in the trenches of fiat money, working, in the interest rate type of team, etc. Just, for our viewers, what was the aha moment, the thing you saw that bothered you the most of that current monetary system? That was the kind of final straw where you decided, I want to pull out of that system and I want to look for something better.
I think there are two things for sure. One is that when you understand how the system works, you realize how destructive it is. And I would go as far as to say that the plastic in the sea, the global warming, is largely a consequence of the interest-based fiat money system.
Yeah.
It's got that far. And I wrote about that in the first edition of The Problem of Interest because I could see how it's happening. We are in a system of forced economic growth. There is not enough money for the society to pay its debt back plus the interest. It has to borrow next year in order to repay this year. Somewhere, someone has to do it. Individuals may escape from debt, sure, and repay, but the society as a whole, because there is not enough money supply to repay the interest charge which the banks put on their created money, right? So this forces economic growth on society, in effect. Companies, people, governments are trying to grow all the time because they think, well, this is the only way to earn more money to repay my debt. And that forced economic growth has brought us to where we are. Pollution and warming and, unnecessary forced. That's what I mean, economic growth. There is another side to it that if you look at how the system allocates resources, is incredibly unjust. And I've said this many times, but I would like to see more people saying it back to me, really, that if you have a system based on interest, the way banks allocate capital is by giving it to rich people, because they're the ones who have the collateral. And the collateral can be seized if the borrower's business goes badly and sold, and then the bank gets back what it loaned. That system naturally biases the lending of funds to rich people, because poor people who don't have collateral don't get the loans from the bank. And everybody knows who, when they go to the bank and they've got a new startup and they've never done one before, the bank isn't keen on lending. They want maybe your dad to give security of his house, or they ask for security. Now, if you have a system that's based on equity, what I realized fairly quickly was that in equity, the only way for a bank to make profit is by sharing your success. And if it shares your success, then it's not interested so much in your collateral. It's interested in your project. Is it a good one? Is it going to be successful? Right? Is it going to make profit? So the banks immediately focus on the project and not on your wealth. And this is decisive, because it means now that people who are poor, they can have good business ideas. They can have good business plans. and therefore under an equity system they can raise money. Right. So the wealth inequality that we have is largely reinforced and compounded by the fact that new capital, newly created money is given to those who are already wealthy, and the wealth circulates among the rich and the poor people are. And we're seeing that empirically. The wealth inequality is growing tremendously in many, many countries and has grown over the last 30 years, over the last 70 years. It's not quite as bad as it was before the First World War in the United Kingdom, by the way, but I mean, that was an extreme example of aristocracy, abusing the public domain. But here, these two things, when you see this, plus the fact that, these big banking institutions boast of how wonderful they are and how prudent and, that have Federal Reserve, these names, it's neither federal nor has it any reserves, and the prudency of the system, prudent bank, you keep on here, and then you realize that this is totally imprudent. They are creating money from nothing, and if I did that, I would go to prison. If I had a machine and I printed, I'd go to prison. Why can they not only do it, but they're protected by law in doing it? They don't get arrested. They get bailed out if they do it, etc. So I think all those things start to come together, and then you're forced, really to accept that we have to do things differently. And this is not, this isn't just some Islamic radical speaking. This is what people have said through generations, from and before Jefferson. If you go back into the Muslim world, and they talk about the occasional monetary collapses which happened, and Makrizi in the Mamluk monetary inflation in Egypt. If you read what they say about that, it's precisely the same thing: the creation of money out of nothing, account money, and how they did in those days. So these are all on their own massive invalidating issues to but when you combine them together, it really is producing a disaster. So I think, that's then if we come to the solution for that, I can talk about why I chose to go with gold when I started in this journey, if you like.
Yeah, please do. I mean, we actually would like to know about how you came to be a gold bug, and you've realized at this point that, well, finance isn't working for the people. Islamic finance is a sort of dubious alternative at best, and there's a more fundamental change that needs to take place here. It's the monetary system itself. Why do we think gold is that solution?
Right. So so going back to 1990, remember I was researching 1993, 94, 95. There was no cryptocurrency in those days. You have to put these things into context. One of the message I tried to give to the scholars who were looking at establishing the new Islamic banking system, or growing it, or hopefully developing it from what it had been in the 1970s when it started to get going kind of properly in the Gulf. The direction that I wanted to give them was to say, look, you really can't have Islamic finance with un-Islamic money. If the money is compromised, if the money is only created through an interest-bearing loan, the shadow of the interest-bearing loan will fall on everything the money touches in some way. Now, maybe it's too philosophical for some. Maybe they need to hear a clear legal argument, that there are hadith and this, that, and the other, and there's an illah and this, but philosophically, I thought that was my best chance. If I could show them the money is created through an interest-bearing loan and in no other way, for 95% of it, then maybe something would click, right? And of course, then I had to have an alternative, because they would come and say, but what's your alternative? The whole system works like this. Well, I could point to a bit of history. The founding of the Bank of England, the founding of the Federal Reserve, when they were required to keep a certain portion of gold in reserve against their note issue. I could point to Western experience and why they had done that. And I could point to, the quotes of great thinkers in Western banking who, had supported the use of gold. And I thought, again, that anchoring the system in a base money which could not be created at the whim of the banks or of the government of the day, or of a central bank appointed and controlled by the government, or worse, by a central bank not controlled by the government. I thought that these were self-evident things. it's always the case in exigency that the state resorts to the printing press to print money, and if they can. But if money is defined as a unit of gold and that's what's in people's pockets, then you can't defraud the people. I mean, you'd have to go to each person and assault them and take their money. That is the guarantee. Gold in the back of your pocket, not even deposited in the bank with a receipt, because you know what the banks are going to do with that gold. They might even tell you we've got 100% reserve, and they won't have. This is just the history of banking. Thousands of banks have done that across the nations, across history. So I felt that that was a kind of technical, empirical thing, which one could give an independent anchor to the system. It works economically in the sense that people, I think, now understand that the production of money, if it has a factor cost, then it naturally keeps pace with prices in the economy. There's a balance. And I've explained this before, and I explain this in my book, that if the factor cost, the cost of the capital equipment which you use to dig the gold, is very high because inflation has gone up, then people won't buy that capital equipment to mine gold, and therefore the mining of gold will reduce. The money supply will not grow; it may even shrink. And as money supply falls, prices come down. And if prices go down too far, then it's good commercial logic to buy cheap capital equipment and manufacture gold, because that gold has high purchasing power when prices are cheap. So you manufacture gold, turn it into money, money supply rises, and price rises. And this thing, over the decades balances out. Now that's a market-based mechanism. If you believe in free markets, then you should favor that kind of mechanism for the production of money, a balanced cycle over, maybe 30, 40 years, you will have a balance and there won't be too many strict departures from it because you're on a 100% reserve system. And of course, we don't have that now. What we have, what we boast about free markets, that we live in a free market, but the key price in the free market, the interest rate, is determined by a group of men in a closed room with no market intervention. They sit down and they put their finger in there and decide whether the interest rate should go up or down. Where is the market mechanism there? Where is the free market? So on the one hand, we have the boasting of modern economics about the primacy of the free market, and yet in the reality we have none. So I think I can put together a good empirical argument, but of course this is not necessarily the thing that works with Islamic scholars. They look at hadith, they look at Quran first, they look at hadith, they look at the experience and the commentary of the scholars, and then they think about common practical needs of the present. I think then, if you want to focus on that, the evidence is very strong, because the Prophet, peace be upon him, used gold and silver, and the rule in Sharia is that you cannot prohibit what the Prophet, peace be upon him, allowed. And again here, when you see that to be a member of the IMF Charter agreement, you must, as a member country, prohibit the use of gold as money, then you know there's something wrong. That should be a warning sign immediately. Why? They're prohibiting something the Prophet allowed. So I think in that sense, if you look at the use of gold and silver by the Prophet, it wasn't, I think, according to the majority of scholars, they would not say that it is the only form of money. But it tends to be the money that humanity has chosen throughout history, where it's given freedom, free choice. That is not to say that you can't use other forms of money. And in Saifuddin's blog some time ago, I was just revisiting that yesterday, we made the point that Umar was thinking of using camel skin as money to produce money. And they didn't turn it down because they thought camel skin was haram as a sort of money. They turned it down because they thought everyone would kill the camels and they'd have nothing to ride on. So it was a practical decision and not a fiqh decision, right? And that's important. I think it's very important to know. And it's not, prohibited because the law works on a basis of prohibition. You have to look at what's prohibited. We don't ask whether Bitcoin is permissible. We ask, is it impermissible? And it's on the onus is on the people who prohibit to show you the evidence for it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead, Ralph.
Oh, yeah. So hearing you talk about gold and the free market side of things. So I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of the difficulty adjustment in Bitcoin. And it sounds extremely similar in the way you described, gold demand and supply, how it affects capital investing and all that. So Bitcoin has a very similar self-correcting mechanism to make sure that, the network is stable every 10 minutes. The issuance is stable, similar to how gold issuance is relatively stable, like you said, over long periods of time. Now, from a practical point of view, so yes, most Bitcoiners, 99% of them, I would say, have an affinity for gold. I mean, we like gold, especially in its physical form, real commodity gold, not ETF paper gold, because
Mm,
you touched on some of the risks of that. So from a
mm,
practical point of view, going back to a actual gold barter systems, do you have concerns? Like, I'm just thinking from a non-theoretical point of view, and this is where I think Bitcoin may assist and may improve upon some of gold's properties. Of course, it needs time, a track record. Gold has 5 years as a track record. But for example, holding huge amounts of gold at home is an inherent risk for individuals if you don't want to trust the banking system and placing your gold there. Second of all, the divisibility of gold for a digital economy where there are microtransactions happening at scale, transacting in gold will become difficult. And also, you can't really transact with gold online while maintaining for sure that the supply isn't being overinflated. How do you perceive we, or is that a concern you think about? Is that one of the struggles from a practical point of view that you think about? I'd love to get your thoughts on that. And I'm not pushing Bitcoin.
mm,
We love gold, but I'm just trying to
mm.
push deeper in that conversation.
Yes, I mean the holding of gold at home is not only a disadvantage but an advantage actually. I would ask you a question:
Yes.
if there was if you knew there was going to be a nuclear war tomorrow, would you hold Bitcoin or gold at home?
I mean,
Uh,
uh,
mm, it's it's not clear, is it? I mean, you probably hold gold because I
well,
don't think
if there
anything
was a
electrical will work after that.
no, but if there was
Probably
a
prefer
nuclear
to hold guns and
disaster,
ammunition.
I would get
Huh?
guns and ammunition.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right, but if you had to hold money, I mean, you would want to eat, and you wouldn't want to give your gun away. I mean, it's not, at the best, it's not clear.
Mm.
You can argue in favor of gold in many ways. I mean, and you can argue in favor of Bitcoin in many ways. We need to compare the same, like with like circumstance with the like circumstance. I think that the issues around Bitcoin are really, what is that unit of value that we're looking at? Is it a conceptual unit of value, or is it somehow a use value in a small way with a conceptual value like fiat money in large part? Because now, if you want to look back in history, we've come from a position where £1 sterling was a pound of silver, 12, 1300 years ago. It's now what? We just don't know. It's £1. It's just a conceptual idea in people's heads, right? And they're using it anyway. And what is Bitcoin in all of this? Is it a commodity like gold? And does gold have a use value? Well, it does have some use value in electronics, in jewelry, but there are scholars who have said, well, this is a strange companion. The only time it benefits you is when it leaves you. And what they mean is that it doesn't have much of a use value, right? And we need to have that conversation about, is I've made this point before again, a house, for example, you can have a record of ownership of your house, and it's called the title deed, and it's held on an electronic database at the land registry. Yeah. The thing that makes that record valuable in any sense, the person who has their name on the record, is the fact that the house exists, because you can live in a house, but you can't live in a title deed. Now, if someone removes a house entirely and says, here's the title deed and this is the value, then no one would accept that in terms of property because there's no use value to the title deed, right? And we have to ask the question, is a record on a database of nothing a value, right? And I'm not answering it either way right now because in some sense it is, in the sense of an ebook, for example. A record on a database is of value because you can read the book and benefit from it, right? And in the sense that I asked you, if there was a nuclear war tomorrow, I would be preferring to hold gold, not a digital wallet, because gold does not need an infrastructure of systems and connections to work. It just needs to be there in your hand. And we know that humanity loves it. Now, I can make that argument, and I can also make arguments in favor of Bitcoin, and I can, tell you what they are. But this discussion about what is money and what is its value, and how can it be used, I think, societies have found their way for thousands of years through this without going into monetary madness. They have used subsidiary coinage. They've used the bimetallic standard, silver for the small transactions, gold for the big ones. They've used copper for the very small transactions, the trimetallic standard. There have been issues where those things have failed because they've fixed the exchange rate between the commodities and the market has said, no, we don't like that, and suddenly the money system isn't working. But we can overcome those if we think carefully. If someone is brave enough and there's an open source system as there is with Bitcoin, and we can look at the data and see that our warrants are fully backed by gold, then there's no problem doing international trade for hundreds of millions with gold. If I want to keep 50 or 60,000 at home, it's about the weight of this paperweight in gold. It's not much. No one's going to find it if I put it in the right place. And I can have, 500 10 grams of that, or 5,000 1 gram pieces, and I can pay much if people want to, I think there is a way around. Those are maybe, let's say, economic and legal questions. The ones that we really need to face are the pragmatic ones. Given that our circumstance, is Bitcoin the best alternative, right? Now, I believe if you compare it to fiat money, it has advantages. It can't be frozen. It is open source. You can see what's going on. You can see how the code works. No one can interfere because it's open, and yet it's anonymous. And it can't be created out of nothing. It can't be manipulated, or not very easily at all. And it's understandable that the Russians and the Chinese too now should be afraid of holding dollars because a button can be pressed in the Federal Reserve or the US Treasury and suddenly they've lost hundreds of billions. And that is the way they're thinking now after the Russian experience. In China, they're thinking that way and considering what to do. So the dollar cannot be argued to be a reserve currency. Now, it's not a reserve currency. It's a mechanism of power. For the United States, and it has been for decades. So in that sense, Bitcoin is something which gives you the anonymity. In the economic sense, it's not created through an interest-based transaction, so Muslims should be happier with it. There is a cost of production, as there is with gold. There are all these things which support its use in a way that has prompted people to call it digital gold. And I think if we decide that we have to be able to prohibit it rather than permit it, then things will be much easier in the discussion.
Very interesting.
Okay, there was a huge amount to unpack there, and we're coming close to the end of our podcast.
Let's check up on time. I know, Tarek, you have a hard stop. How much left do you have on your side? We don't want.
I have 8 minutes. No.
Okay, so Harris, we'll quickly ask a few questions before we wrap it up because there's so much to unpack. We definitely need to come back again if that's possible in the future.
This was a one-off.
This was a one-off. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me ask a question. Let me just we've been talking about Bitcoin and gold and monetary systems, but let me just bring it back to Islamic finance for a second, because you had a period in the 90s where you investigated this, in the 80s and the 90s. And maybe the time wasn't right then. Do you think the time is right now for Islamic finance? Do you see anything out there that interests you, that makes you think actually there is an opportunity for Islamic finance to return to its prophetic roots, and maybe it's away from the banking industry?
Yeah, I do. And the thing I see most is younger people who are switched on and know what's going on. There's a lot more of them around now than there were when, in my day. In my day, you were very often banging your head against a brick wall. Now there are people out there who not only understand, but they're in positions they can influence things. They might be the financial director of a company. They might be, running a think tank, or a CEO of a company wanting finance on a proper, Sharia compliant basis. And there are people in their constituency who want to invest on the Sharia compliant basis, been through the experience of Islamic banking, seen that it's basically the same in substance as interest-based banking, and they're disappointed and they want to have another go. And so I think there are many opportunities. We must be positive. We mustn't give up. We must learn the lessons of the past. The people who want us to fail are still out there. This is a kind of pivotal thing. It's a fulcrum of people who campaign, and they will find themselves under pressures that are not normal, because the system wants to disparage them, wants to discredit them. So I think, in the sense that we can do something, and again, another of my mantras now is to make sure that what you reach for is within your grasp. No use dreaming and reaching for the moon. Let's go one achievable step at a time. If we can, continue to prove the basis of our regulation, that we are trying to do equity type business or genuine rental type business, with what you might call in a secular world an ethical dimension. We don't invest in things that damage the earth. And we do it in a way that has good governance and transparency, then we're doing things that must eventually win. The evil will we can't win forever. It will destroy itself, and we know that. That's a revelation issue, that we have to believe that evil destroys itself. So it's perseverance, really. It's keeping going long enough, longer than the opposition, because it costs them an enormous amount to keep the system going in terms of propaganda, advertising, bailouts, political bribery. All of that is continuing at a massive pace on a daily basis to keep this edifice afloat, which doesn't benefit anybody. How long is that going to continue? Right. So the thing that's good and replaces that and demonstrates that it can replace it, it keeps on growing smaller, but it will get there. For that purpose, we need to have honest products and honest dialogue. People have to know if they invest in a genuinely Islamic way, they may lose. No one's going to come and guarantee your investment. There's no financial services compensation scheme for your equity investment in this. You go in, but then you're going to be getting more than 1 or 2%. You're going to get 10, 15, 20, 30%. I mean, real estate, we make, 50, 60% in a year on some of our projects. And sometimes we lose 5 or 10%, but on balance, we make money and we're still here. So this is the true range of outcomes here. Don't let someone tell you, 3%. Well, you might get 4% if you give, your money to us for 5 years with no withdrawal, And this is pathetic. It really is a scam. And by the time you get it back, it's not worth anything anymore. So we have to make the arguments, that sort of open people's eyes, as well as have the products, and just stay on the right track with the principles that guide our business. And I'm sure that we'll get there. I mean, unless there's a war, and a global war or something which bombs us back to the Stone Age. But otherwise, if we just carry on and show our principles in action, that's the best thing we can do.
Yeah, I love your optimism, Tarek, and I would tend to agree with you. It's getting harder to subsidize the system. And we can notice that with all the geopolitical tensions, the lack of trust in institutions. Really, I think, the COVID years were kind of the turning point to this whole edifice you're describing. And since then, we've noticed a diminishing trust towards institutions, governments, central banks, the banking system itself, with what happened in Canada as well, with the truckers, what happened between Russia, Ukraine, what's happening in the Middle East. It seems like you said the dollar is being weaponized. So the veil has been taken off, and we see the true nature and, ideology behind the reserve currency of the world at the end of the day. So I know we're up on time. I don't want to keep you longer. I just want to say huge thank you for taking the time to join Harris and me. We'd like to give you a little bit of a platform so that, we can share this with our audience and our community. Where can they find you? I know everyone's expecting your second edition, so please, once that fourth edition, sorry,
Yeah.
problem with interest.
Inshallah. I think it's going to be 3 months or so. Inshallah.
Okay, great. So
the problemwithinterest.com, I'll make sure it's there.
Amazing.
I think, in fact, if you go to theproblemwithinterest.com, you'll find your way through to one of my websites, but it's been archived and I haven't touched it for 20 years. So I'll try and set it up though. So by the time this interview goes out, people who go to theproblemwithinterest.com will find their way through to my company.
Amazing.
I have to say, Tarek, in my closing remarks, I have to say that, you were an inspiration for me in the 90s when I first met you. And this book has actually become a sort of spiritual guide for a bunch of young Islamic fintech specialist that you mentioned a little bit earlier as the next generation. And if it wasn't for the work that you did back in the 90s and those 3 years you sat in the British Library looking at things on a first principles basis, I don't think much of this stuff would be happening today. So, they say that we build on the shoulders of giants. You're one of those giants. Thank you for doing what you did.
Well, before I start to cry, I think you're going to have to. Thank you. It's been great speaking with you, and I wish you all the best and see you soon.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Tarek. Appreciate it. Thank you, Harris.
Finally.
Thanks.